Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The reservation stretched before me like a wound across the earth. Miles of cracked soil and weathered rock extended to the horizon, broken only by the occasional twisted mesquite tree or rusted trailer home. I'd been assigned here 3 weeks ago, fresh out of training, eager to prove myself. Now, standing beside Elder Ramirez at the edge of town, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Ramirez was 32, ancient by missionary standards, with deep-set eyes that never seemed to rest. He'd been here 5 months already, longer than most companions lasted in this desolate corner of Arizona. When I asked why his previous companion had transferred early, he just shook his head. "Personal reasons," he'd said. But the way his jaw tightened told a different story. Our apartment sat on the outskirts of the reservation, a squat brick building that looked like it had been fighting a losing battle against the desert for decades. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the windows were reinforced with iron bars that Ramirez insisted were for security, though I noticed how his fingers traced their edges nervously whenever we entered. The first few days passed in a blur of introductions and rejections. The people here were polite but distant, their faces weathered by sun and hardship. Many spoke only broken English, and my fumbling attempts at their language earned me patient smiles that never quite reached their eyes. It was during our 4th night that Ramirez laid out the rules. "Never stay out past sundown," he said, checking the locks on our door for the 3rd time. "No shortcuts through the back roads. If you feel something's wrong, we leave immediately." "Feels a bit dramatic," I said, trying to lighten the mood. He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes made my smile falter. "My last companion thought so too. He lasted 6 weeks before he requested an emergency transfer. Wouldn't say why. Just packed his things in the middle of the night and left." I wanted to press further, but something in his expression warned me off. That night, I lay awake listening to the desert wind howl through the gaps in our windows, wondering what could make a grown man flee in darkness. The reservation had its own rhythm, I discovered. Morning brought the elderly women to their porches, where they'd sit weaving baskets and watching us with knowing eyes. Afternoons were for the workers returning from the uranium mines, their clothes stained with red dust that never seemed to wash out completely. And evenings. Evenings belonged to something else entirely. 2 weeks into my assignment, we had to drive to Superior for supplies. The journey took us through 60 miles of empty highway, past abandoned gas stations, and the skeletal remains of old mining equipment. Ramirez insisted we leave early enough to return before dark, but our shopping had taken longer than expected. Now, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, we were still 20 miles from home. "We should have left earlier," Ramirez muttered, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "We'll make it," I assured him, though the deepening shadows made me less certain with each passing mile. The desert transformed at dusk. What had been merely desolate in daylight became alien and hostile. Joshua trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their spiny arms reaching toward our truck like grasping fingers. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, beyond which anything could be lurking. I was about to suggest we call the district leader, let him know we'd be late, when Ramirez slammed the brakes. The truck's tires screamed against asphalt as we skidded to a stop. My seatbelt cut into my chest, and I braced against the dashboard. "What the hell?" I gasped. Ramirez didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his face drained of color. I followed his gaze and felt my breath catch. Something stood in the middle of the road. At first glance, it looked like a dog. The general shape was right. 4 legs, a tail. But everything else was wrong. Its fur hung in matted clumps, revealing patches of raw, glistening skin beneath. The proportions were off too. The legs too long, the spine curved at an impossible angle. And its head. The head turned toward us with a mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. Where a dog's face should have been was something else. Something that had tried to be a dog but had gotten the details horribly wrong. The muzzle was too short, the eyes too large and placed too high. They reflected our headlights with an unnatural luminescence. "Drive around it," I whispered. "No," Ramirez said through gritted teeth. "We go through. You'll hit it. Good." He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared as we lurched forward. The thing in the road didn't move, didn't even flinch as we barreled toward it. At the last second, I saw its mouth open, not like a dog's mouth, but splitting vertically up its face, revealing rows of teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. There was no impact. One moment it was there, the next we were through, and when I twisted to look back, the road was empty. "Don't look back," Ramirez snapped. "Never look back." "What was that thing?" "Stop talking about it." His voice was sharp with fear. "Don't think about it. Don't give it power." We drove the rest of the way in silence, but I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. The way it had looked at us, with an intelligence that was calculating, patient, hungry. That night I couldn't eat. The image of that thing on the road kept replaying in my mind. Ramirez picked at his food too, occasionally glancing at the windows as if expecting to see something peering in. "You've seen it before," I said. It wasn't a question. He set down his fork slowly. 3 weeks ago. Different spot, same road. My companion, Elder Thorne, he wanted to get out, take a picture. I had to physically hold him in the truck. What happened to him? Started having dreams. Said something was calling his name at night. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Ramirez pushed his plate away. "Look, there are things out here that... they're not natural. The locals know it. Why do you think they lock themselves in after dark?" As if in response to his words, something scratched at our door. We both froze. The sound came again, long, deliberate strokes against the wood. Not knocking exactly. More like something testing the barrier, seeing how strong it was. "Elder Ramirez," a voice called from outside. It sounded like our district leader, Elder Hutchins, but there was something off about the cadence. Too measured, too perfect. "Elder Johnson, I need to speak with you." Ramirez grabbed my arm as I started to rise. "That's not him." "How do you know?" "Hutchins is in Phoenix this week. Family emergency." His grip tightened. "Whatever's out there, it's not human." The scratching intensified, and the voice came again, still maintaining that eerily perfect impression of Hutchins. "Elders, please, it's important. Open the door." I pulled out my phone and dialed Hutchins' number. After 3 rings, a groggy voice answered. "Johnson? What's wrong?" "Where are you right now?" "In my apartment." "Why are you calling it?" The scratching grew louder, and I heard Hutchins suck in a breath through the phone. "Is that sound on your end?" "Send me a photo. Now." Confusion in his voice, but he complied. Moments later, my phone buzzed with an image of Hutchins and his companion in their Phoenix apartment. Timestamp confirming they were nowhere near us. The thing outside must have sensed our recognition. The voice changed, became something between human speech and animal growl. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." The door shook as something heavy slammed against it. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. We waited, hardly breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Ramirez crept to the window and peered through a gap in the blinds. His face went white. "It's gone," he whispered. But what?" He pointed with a trembling finger. I looked out and saw them. Muddy prints leading up to our door. They started as dog tracks but gradually morphed into something else. By the time they reached our doorstep, they were almost human. Almost. The tracks led away from our door and simply ended. As if whatever made them had vanished into the air. Sleep was impossible after that. We spent the night in shifts, one watching while the other tried to rest. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted, but alive. The district meeting was scheduled for 10 that morning. Part of me wanted to skip it, to hole up in our apartment and wait for our transfer date. But Ramirez insisted we go. Isolation is what it wants, he said. We stick to routine. We don't let it win. The meeting was held in a church building 30 miles north, where 6 other missionary companionships gathered weekly to report their progress. Usually these meetings were boring affairs, statistics, goals, the occasional faith-promoting story. Today, the atmosphere was different. Elder Hutchins looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. His companion, Elder Miller, kept glancing at the windows as if expecting something to crash through them. The others seemed subdued, too, their usual enthusiasm dampened by something unspoken. When it came time to share experiences from the week, I hesitated. Ramirez shot me a warning look, but Hutchins noticed my reluctance. Elder Johnson, something you'd like to share? I cleared my throat. We've had some unusual experiences, disturbances at night, strange sounds. The room went silent. Every eye turned to me, and I saw recognition in several faces. They knew. They'd experienced it too. What kind of disturbances? Hutchins asked quietly. I described the knocking, the voice, carefully omitting the thing on the road. As I spoke, I watched the other elders exchange meaningful glances. Elder Peterson, stationed 20 miles south of us, had gone particularly pale. It's getting worse, Peterson said suddenly. Last month it was just sounds. Now they're getting bolder. Sister Martinez in my area, she saw one in broad daylight last week, said it was wearing her dead husband's face. That's enough, Hutchins said sharply, but Peterson continued. How long are we supposed to pretend this is normal? How long before one of us— I said that's enough! Hutchins slammed his hand on the podium. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. He took a deep breath, visibly composing himself. After the meeting, Johnson, Ramirez, I need to speak with you privately. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. When it ended, the other elders filed out quickly, eager to return to their areas before dark. Only we remained, waiting as Hutchins gathered his thoughts. How much do you know about the history of this reservation? He asked finally. Not much, I admitted. Just that it was established in the 1890s. Hutchins nodded slowly. There's more to it than that. Much more. The land here, it was considered cursed long before the reservation was established. The indigenous people who lived here originally, they had stories, warnings, about things that wore the skins of animals and men. Skinwalkers, Ramirez said quietly, among other names. Hutchins pulled out a worn notebook, pages filled with cramped handwriting. I've been keeping records, every incident, every sighting. The pattern is escalating. He showed us entries dating back 2 years. Missionaries reporting strange animals, voices in the night, figures that shouldn't exist. Several entries ended abruptly, marked only with transferred or medical leave. Why hasn't the mission president done anything? I asked. What would you have him do? Tell the church leadership that we're being hunted by Native American demons? Hutchins laughed bitterly. They'd shut down the mission and have us all in therapy within a week. So what do? We survive. We follow the rules. And we pray that nothing worse happens. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe his own words. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond our understanding, beyond our ability to control. We were walking a tightrope over an abyss, and something in the darkness was waiting for us to fall. The next 3 days passed without major incident, but the tension never left. We went through the motions of our missionary work, but our hearts weren't in it. How could we preach about faith and protection when we barricaded ourselves indoors each night like prisoners? It was a Tuesday when things escalated beyond recognition. We'd spent the day in the small community of Cedar Ridge, teaching an elderly woman named Maria Santos. She'd served us pozole and listened politely to our message. But I noticed how she kept glancing at the window, how her hands trembled when she poured our water. As we prepared to leave, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You should not be here after dark," she whispered in broken English. "They know you now. They smell your fear." "Who knows us?" I asked, but she just shook her head and pushed us toward the door. We were driving back, still an hour from home, when the truck's engine began to sputter. Ramirez pumped the gas pedal, but the vehicle continued to slow. "No, no, no," he muttered, pulling to the side of the road as the engine died completely. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no wind, nothing. The desert held its breath, waiting. "We need to call someone," I said, reaching for my phone. No signal. Of course. Ramirez tried the ignition again. Nothing. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and shadow. "We walk," he said, grabbing our emergency bag from behind the seat. "It's 15 miles to town." "Then we better start moving." We'd made it maybe half a mile when we heard it. A sound like laughter, but wrong. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocks in ways that defied physics. My skin erupted in goosebumps. "Keep walking," Ramirez said, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The laughter came again, closer now. And then we saw them. They emerged from behind rocks and scraggly bushes, moving with a fluidity that made my stomach turn. At first glance, they looked like coyotes, but their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. They flanked us on both sides, keeping pace but maintaining distance. One of them turned its head toward us, and I bit back a scream. The face was wrong. Features shifting and sliding like wax under heat. One moment animal, the next almost human. Its eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and malevolent. "Don't run," Ramirez whispered. "Whatever you do, don't run." We continued walking, surrounded by our silent escort. The sun touched the horizon, and in the dying light, I saw more shapes moving in the desert. Dozens of them, all wrong, all watching. Then, impossibly, we heard a car engine. A pickup truck crested the hill ahead, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. It pulled up beside us, and the driver, a Navajo man in his 60s, leaned out. "Get in, now." We didn't need to be told twice. As soon as we were inside, he floored it, tires kicking up dust. In the side mirror, I watched our escorts fade into the darkness, but their eyes, so many eyes, continued to gleam in the distance. "You missionaries?" the man asked. "Yes, sir." He shook his head. "Foolish. Very foolish to be out here at this hour. They've been watching you for weeks." "Who are they?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Not they," he corrected. "It. What you saw was one entity, wearing many skins. It's old, older than the reservation, older than my people's memory, and it's hungry." He dropped us at our apartment, refusing our offers of gas money or gratitude. "Lock your doors," he said as he drove away. "Burn sage if you have it. And whatever you do, don't invite anything inside. Not even if it sounds like someone you know. Especially if it sounds like someone you know." That night, we didn't sleep. We couldn't. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Ramirez had found some sage at a local store, and the smoke filled our small apartment with its pungent scent. Whether it helped or not, I couldn't say, but it gave us something to do. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. Our breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows. The sage smoke swirled in patterns that defied the still air. "It's here," Ramirez whispered. The knocking started again, but this time it came from everywhere. The door, the windows, the walls, even the ceiling. A cacophony of demands for entry, each knock perfectly timed with our heartbeats. Then the voices began. "Jacob." My mother's voice drifted through the door. "Jacob, sweetie, let me in. I've come so far to see you." I squeezed my eyes shut. My mother was in California, 2 states away. This wasn't her. "Miguel," Ramirez's brother called from the window. "Miguel, hermano, ayúdame." Ramirez crossed himself, lips moving in silent prayer. The voices multiplied, became a chorus of everyone we'd ever loved, ever trusted. Parents, siblings, friends, past companions, all begging for entry, all wrong in subtle ways. The desperation in their tones increased, becoming angry, threatening. "You can't hide forever," my father's voice snarled. "We know where you live. We know where your families live." Something slammed against the door so hard the frame cracked. Another impact, and splinters flew. Whatever was outside had given up on deception. I grabbed the largest knife from our kitchen drawer, knowing it was useless but needing something in my hands. Ramirez clutched his scriptures, reciting passages from memory. The door burst open. What entered wasn't human, wasn't animal, wasn't anything that should exist. It flowed like liquid shadow, constantly shifting between forms. Now a massive wolf, now a twisted human shape, now something with too many limbs and eyes in all the wrong places. The sage smoke recoiled from it, and the temperature dropped even further. It spoke with 1,000 voices, all overlapping. "You looked. You saw. You're mine now." I understood then. That thing on the road, when I'd stared at it, when I'd made eye contact, I'd created a connection, given it permission to hunt us. The creature lunged forward, and time seemed to slow. I raised the knife, knowing it was futile. Ramirez stepped in front of me, holding his scriptures like a shield. And then, impossibly, it stopped. Light erupted from somewhere, not electric light, but something pure and warm. The creature recoiled, its many forms writhing in apparent agony. Through the broken doorway, I saw him, the old Navajo man who'd rescued us on the road. He stood there with something in his hands, something that blazed with that impossible light. The creature fled, dissolving into shadow and racing through the door. The man stepped inside, and I saw what he carried. A bundle of items wrapped in white deerskin, adorned with turquoise and eagle feathers. "This won't hold it forever," he said calmly, as if interdimensional horrors were an everyday occurrence. "But it will give you time." "Time for what?" I gasped. "To leave. Tonight. Don't pack, don't call anyone, just go. Drive until sunrise and don't stop for anything." We didn't argue. Within minutes, we were in our truck, driving through the empty streets. The old man had given us specific instructions. Take Highway 60 west, don't deviate, don't stop until we reached Phoenix. He'd painted symbols on our truck with ash and oil, muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The first hour passed in tense silence. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every movement in our peripheral vision made us flinch. But the highway remained empty, and gradually we began to hope we might actually escape. Then Ramirez glanced in the rearview mirror and swore. I turned to look and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was following us, keeping pace exactly 100 yards back. It looked like a truck at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. As I watched, it shifted, becoming a massive running figure, then a rolling mass of darkness, then back to a vehicle. "How fast are we going?" I asked. 85, Ramirez replied, pushing harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed, 90, 95, 100. The thing behind us maintained its distance perfectly, effortlessly. "It's toying with us," I realized. As if in response, our pursuer suddenly surged forward. In seconds, it was right behind us, and in the mirror, I could see it for what it truly was. A writhing mass of stolen skins and faces, all animated by something ancient and evil. I recognized some of those faces from missing person posters I'd seen in town. It slammed into our bumper, sending us swerving. Ramirez fought for control as we fishtailed across empty lanes. Another impact, harder this time. The truck's engine coughed. No, not now. But our speed was dropping. 80, 70, 60. The thing pulled alongside us. Through the driver's side window, I saw it perfectly. My own face staring back at me, but wrong. The smile too wide. The eyes reflecting depths that shouldn't exist. "Don't look at it," Ramirez shouted, but it was too late. My doppelganger spoke with my voice. "You can't run from yourself, Jacob. I'm already inside you, growing. Soon, you'll shed that weak skin and become something beautiful." Terror gave way to something else, a strange calm, almost a longing. Maybe it would be easier to just stop, to let it happen. What was I fighting so hard for anyway? "Johnson!" Ramirez punched my shoulder, snapping me back. "Fight it!" I tore my gaze away, but the damage was done. I could feel something squirming inside my thoughts, whispering promises of power and freedom from fear. All I had to do was let go. The truck's engine gave a final shuddering cough and died. We coasted to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. The thing circled us like a shark, forms shifting hypnotically in the darkness. This was it. We were going to die here, or worse, become like it. Then I heard it. Engines, multiple engines, approaching fast. 3 pickup trucks crested the hill behind us, headlights blazing. They surrounded our stalled vehicle, and men poured out. Some Navajo, some Apache, all carrying objects that seemed to bend the light around them. The thing that had been hunting us let out a sound like reality tearing. It launched itself at the nearest man, but he raised something. A staff adorned with feathers and bones, and the creature bounced off an invisible barrier. What followed was a battle I could barely comprehend. The men chanted in their native tongues while the entity raged and shifted, trying every form imaginable to break through their defenses. Lightning split the clear sky, and the desert sand turned to glass where their powers clashed. Finally, with a shriek that made my ears bleed, the thing fled into the desert depths. The men didn't pursue. Instead, one of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair, approached our truck. "You're lucky," she said. "We've been tracking that one for months. It's old, maybe the oldest on the reservation." "Is it gone?" I asked. "For now, but you've been marked, both of you." She studied us with eyes that seemed to see too much. "You need to leave, tonight, and never come back." "But our mission—" "Your mission is over," she said firmly. "Would your God want you to throw away your lives and souls for pride? Go home. Live. Forget this place." They escorted us to the reservation border, our truck somehow running again despite the damage. As we crossed that invisible line, I felt something lift from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. We drove through the night and into the dawn, not stopping until we reached Phoenix. Only then did we call our mission president, reporting a medical emergency that required immediate transfer. He didn't ask questions. I think he knew. 6 months have passed since that night. Ramirez and I were transferred to different missions, him to Oregon, me to Virginia. We don't talk about what happened. What would we say? Who would believe us? But the dreams haven't stopped. Every night I'm back on that empty highway, staring into eyes that reflect infinite darkness. Sometimes I'm running, sometimes I'm the one doing the chasing. The worst dreams are when I can't tell the difference. I've researched obsessively since returning. Skinwalker legends, possession stories, accounts from other missionaries who served on reservations. The patterns are there if you know where to look. Companions transferred for medical reasons, areas suddenly closed to missionary work, stories whispered but never officially recorded. Last week I got an email from Ramirez. Just 2 words. It's here. I knew immediately what he meant. The marks we carry, they're like beacons. That thing, or others like it, they can find us wherever we go. The protection of leaving the reservation only goes so far. I've started seeing signs here too. Animals that watch too intently. Shadows that move against the light. Voices calling my name when I'm alone. Yesterday, I was teaching a family about faith when their dog started growling at empty air. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and in the frost forming on the window, I saw a face I recognized. My own, but wearing that too wide smile. The family couldn't see it. Only I could. Only I can. I've bought sage, learned protection prayers in languages I don't speak, surrounded myself with symbols from a dozen different traditions. But deep down, I know it's just delay tactics. That thing in the desert, it's patient. It has all the time in the world. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself wondering if it would be easier to just give in. The whispers promise an end to fear, to human limitations. All I have to do is shed this skin and embrace what I'm becoming. But then I remember Ramirez's face that night. The determination as he stood between me and that horror. I remember the old Navajo man who saved us. The warriors who fought to give us a chance at escape. They believed we were worth saving. Maybe that's enough. I don't know how this ends. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe some battles you don't win. You just keep fighting, one day at a time, one night at a time. The sun is setting now. Time to check the locks, light the sage, and prepare for another night of waiting. Somewhere out there, in the space between human and animal, between real and nightmare, something is calling my name. I won't answer. Not tonight. Not yet. The gravel road crunched under our boots as Jake and I made our way deeper into the misty forest. Rays of morning sunlight filtered through the dense evergreen canopy overhead. The air felt thick and heavy with moisture. "Did the sheriff say where exactly those hikers went missing?" Jake asked, adjusting his ranger hat. "Somewhere along the Whispering Pines Trail near Spirit Lake," I replied. "Same area as the other disappearances over the past few months." I had been stationed as a ranger in national parks and forests across the country over the years. From the lush, temperate rainforests of Olympic National Park in Washington, to the rugged shores of Lake Superior in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, to the rolling Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. But in all my time, I had never experienced anything like the disturbing incidents that plagued this remote wilderness. It started with odd reports from hikers and campers, glimpses of shadowy figures darting between the trees, strange noises echoing through the night, belongings that went missing from tents. We chalked it up to black bears or transients at first, but then people began to disappear without a trace. Seasoned outdoorsmen and women who knew these woods like the back of their hand vanished, as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, leaving no signs of a struggle, just empty campsites and abandoned gear. Jake and I continued hiking in silence for a while, immersed in our own thoughts. We had grown accustomed to the tranquil solitude of the backcountry, but today the stillness felt different, ominous, like an invisible, malevolent presence watching us from the shadows. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I suddenly spotted an old Native American man sitting on a fallen log, as if waiting for us. Long silver hair framed his weathered face. He wore a fringed buckskin jacket and held a wooden walking stick across his lap. Jake shot me a quizzical look and shrugged. We approached the man cautiously. "Morning," I called out. "Are you all right, sir? What brings you way out here?" The old man lifted his head slowly and fixed me with a penetrating stare. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and hollow, like wind through bare branches. "Leave this place, now, while you still can. He stood up stiffly, using his staff for support. The Wendigo walks again, and it hungers. A chill rippled down my spine at his words. I had heard the old Algonquin legend before, a mythical man-eating creature, the embodiment of insatiable greed and gluttony, able to possess humans and turn them into cannibalistic monsters. But that's all it was. A legend. A scary campfire story, right? The old man must have seen the skepticism on my face. He shook his head sadly. You rangers, you think you know these woods, but there are ancient, evil things here that should never be disturbed. He turned to leave, calling over his shoulder. When you walk the forest, beware those who walk like you, but are not you. With that, he disappeared into the trees, leaving Jake and I standing on the trail in stunned silence. Jake shattered the eerie quiet. What the hell was that about? I shook my head, still rattled by the old man's ominous warning. No idea. Probably just some local trying to scare us off. I wanted to believe my own words, to dismiss the encounter as nothing more than the ramblings of a superstitious elder. But an uneasy knot had settled into my gut. We continued our patrol along the meandering trail, eyes and ears alert for any signs of the missing hikers. The forest seemed to close in around us, the towering firs and spruces pressing closer with each step. Shafts of sunlight grew scarcer as the canopy thickened overhead. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I found myself scanning the shadows between the trees, half expecting some nightmarish creature to come lunging out at any moment. The Wendigo, an insatiable famine spirit. The more it ate, the more ravenous it grew. I gave myself a mental shake, trying to dislodge the macabre folktale from my mind. I was a seasoned ranger, not some gullible tourist. There had to be a rational explanation for the strange occurrences and disappearances. Wild animals, sinkholes, disoriented hikers wandering off trail. As we hiked, I asked Jake to tell me more about his experiences in other parks, hoping to keep the mood light. He had some great stories from his seasons at the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin and Keystone State Park in Pennsylvania. I shared a few of my own misadventures, like the time I had to rescue a terrified family from their cabin after a black bear invited itself over for midnight snacks in Oregon's Crater Lake. I was just in the middle of recounting the incident when a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It sounded like a woman's voice, raw with primal terror. And it was close. Jake and I froze, exchanging horrified glances. Then we were running, crashing through the underbrush toward the source of the scream. Low-hanging branches whipped at my face and arms as I sprinted, barely feeling the sting. My heart hammered against my ribcage. After several frenzied minutes, we burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, gasping for breath. There was no one there, no signs of a struggle, just a bright blue backpack lying abandoned next to the trail. It looked like it had been torn open by some tremendous force, the contents strewn about haphazardly. I scanned the trampled ground desperately for any clues to what had happened. That's when I noticed the footprints. They started out boot-shaped, a woman's size, leading into the clearing from the north. But a few feet from the discarded pack, they changed. Morphed into an enormous shape I didn't recognize, like no animal I had ever seen. The prints were at least 18 inches long, with 3 splayed, clawed toes on each foot. Definitely not human, but not quite animal either. And they lead away from the clearing, back into the woods, in the same direction we had just come from. A wave of ice crashed over me as I stared at the incomprehensible tracks. The old man's haunting words echoed through my mind. When you walk the forest, beware those who walk like you, but are not you. What had we just stumbled onto? What nightmare was lurking in this wilderness, preying on unsuspecting hikers? I forced down the rising panic, trying to think logically. We had to get back to the ranger station and report this, gather a search party. But as I turned to head back up the trail with Jake, I couldn't shake the skin-crawling sensation that we were no longer alone in these woods, that some ravenous, malevolent presence had caught our scent and was silently stalking us through the shadows. waiting for the right moment to pounce. The Wendigo walks again, and it hungers. By the time Jake and I made it back to the ranger station, dusk was falling. Towering evergreens cast long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. The normal daytime sounds of birdsong and insect chirps had faded, replaced by an oppressive, watchful silence. Every rustle of leaves or creak of branches made me whirl around, half expecting to see some nightmare creature lunging from the underbrush. We staggered into the station, chests heaving and slick with sweat despite the deepening chill in the air. Liza, the other ranger on duty, took one look at our ashen faces and demanded to know what happened. In halting, clipped sentences, I filled her in on the terrifying scream, the abandoned backpack, the enormous inhuman footprints leading into the woods. I expected her to look at me like I had lost my mind, to insist there had to be a rational explanation. Black bear, cougar maybe. But to my surprise, Liza simply closed her eyes and bowed her head, as if the news was grave but not shocking. When she finally met my gaze again, her expression was grim. "It's happening again," she murmured, "just like when I was a kid." Liza told us how she had grown up on the reservation bordering the national forest, how the tribal elders used to warn them about going too deep into the woods alone, about the hungry thing that lived in the shadows and mist, the Wendigo. According to the stories, the Wendigo was once human, a man driven to madness and murder, forced to consume the flesh of his companions to survive a long, brutal winter. In doing so, he transformed into a vengeful spirit. The more he ate, the larger and more powerful he grew, but also more insatiable. Always ravenous, roaming the forest in search of new victims. Liza said every few decades, there would be a rash of disappearances in the area. Hikers, hunters, loggers vanishing without a trace. The authorities always chalked it up to bear attacks or people getting lost. But the elders knew. They could feel the Wendigo's malevolent presence stalking the woods during those times, like a predator catching the scent of blood on the wind. I didn't want to believe it. The logical part of my brain kept insisting there had to be another explanation for the disturbing signs we had found. But the visceral terror I had felt in those woods, the skin-crawling sensation of being watched by some nightmarish entity, was undeniable. We radioed the sheriff and reported the missing hiker. Within an hour, a search party had assembled. Grim-faced deputies, volunteer firefighters, search and rescue personnel. Liza, Jake, and I led them back to the spot where we had found the abandoned backpack. But as we retraced our steps through the darkening forest, a sense of dread settled over me like a shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led into a trap. That the Wendigo was out there, watching us from the shadows, toying with us. We scoured the woods for hours, calling out the missing woman's name until our voices went hoarse. But besides a few scraps of torn clothing and more of those unsettling, elongated footprints, we found no trace of her. Well past midnight, the sheriff finally called off the search until daybreak. Exhausted and dispirited, we made our way back to the ranger station. But I knew I wouldn't be getting any sleep that night. How could I, knowing that a ravenous monster was prowling the darkness just beyond the tree line? I thought back to the old Native American man who had accosted us on the trail and his chilling warning. At the time, I had dismissed him as a superstitious kook. But now, I was beginning to wonder if the folk tales he spoke of held more truth than I ever could have imagined. The Wendigo walks again. And it hungers. How many more would fall victim to its insatiable greed before this nightmare was over? The next morning dawned cold and gray, mist curling through the trees like spectral fingers. I felt like I had aged a decade over the last 24 hours, my body leaden with exhaustion and my nerves scraped raw. Jake, Liza, and I gathered back at the ranger station, steeling ourselves for another brutal day of searching. The mood was somber, a sense of grim resignation hanging over us. We all knew that with each passing hour, the chances of finding the missing hiker alive grew slimmer. I pulled up a map of the national forest on the computer, trying to plot out our strategy. But as I studied the screen, a chilling realization crept over me. All the disappearances had occurred within a rough 5-mile radius. And at the epicenter of that circle was an abandoned mine shaft dating back to the early 1900s. An icy finger traced down my spine as I remembered another detail from the Wendigo legends Liza had shared. The creatures were said to lair underground, in caves or mine shafts, hibernating for years or even decades between feeding frenzies, emerging to hunt only when their hunger grew too monstrous to ignore. I grabbed a red marker and circled the mine on the map, feeling like I was marking the lair of the Minotaur in some nightmarish labyrinth. "We need to search here today," I said grimly, tapping the map. "If there's any chance the missing hikers are still alive, this is where we'll find them." Jake blanched at my words, but nodded in agreement. Liza just stared at the spot with haunted eyes, memories of childhood tales of terror playing across her face. We gathered our gear in tense silence. In addition to the standard survival equipment, I slipped a flare gun and serrated hunting knife into my pack. Ranger rules were clear on avoiding weapons, but something told me we were going to need more than radio and first aid training before this was over. The hike to the abandoned mine felt like a death march. Low fog clung to the forest floor, swirling around the bases of trees like a ghostly tide. Sounds seemed muffled and distorted, even our footfalls oddly flat. Several times I whipped my head around, certain I had glimpsed a tall, emaciated figure lurking in the mist behind us. But there was never anything there. We found the mine entrance half hidden behind a dense tangle of underbrush and vines, as if the forest itself was trying to seal it off. Rotten timbers framed the dark opening, a few rusted pieces of machinery lying discarded nearby, slowly being reclaimed by moss and roots. The air felt different near the mine. Colder, hungrier, if that was even possible, as if some malevolent force was tucked inside, luring us closer with its patient, predatory need. I exchanged a wordless glance with Jake and Liza. We all felt it. The skin-crawling sensation of being watched by some nightmarish entity. The almost subliminal tug, the crawling compulsion to step into the darkness and surrender ourselves to the ravenous presence within. I shook my head violently, trying to shatter the hypnotic pull. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this vile place as possible. But if there was even a chance that the hikers were still alive, trapped in the Wendigo's lair, we had to go on. Forcing down my churning nausea, I unclipped my flashlight and shone the beam into the mine's gaping maw. The darkness swallowed the light after a few feet. My last thought before stepping across the threshold was that the old Native American man had been right. We rangers thought we knew these woods, but there were ancient, hungry things here that should never be disturbed. The Wendigo walks again, and we were entering its den. The air inside the mine was frigid and heavy with the musty stench of decay. It felt like stepping into a meat locker that had been sealed for a century. Our flashlight beams danced over crumbling rock walls, rotted support timbers, rusted chains and cables snaking across the floor like skeletal serpents. But worse than the cold, worse than the smell, was the skin-crawling sensation of being watched by malevolent eyes, of a predatory presence savoring our every move, guiding us deeper into its trap on a leash of our own compassion. We moved slowly, sweeping the light over every crevice and shadow, looking for any signs of the missing hikers, or the Wendigo. I wasn't sure which I feared more. The tunnel narrowed as we pushed deeper, the walls pressing in until we had to hunch our shoulders and walk single file. Our breathing sounded too loud, the scuff of boots against gravel thunderous. I found myself straining to hear over the pulse pounding in my ears. Alert for any alien sound in the darkness. A scrape of claw on stone. A hungry, rattling inhale. After a few hundred feet, the shaft opened into a larger chamber, the ceiling soaring high overhead. Our lights couldn't reach the top, hinting at a vast, impenetrable darkness pressing down. "Look!" Jake swept his beam over the far wall, voice tight with horror. A ragged oval gaped in the rock, twice as tall as a man, edges crusted with something dark and flaky. Scrambling closer, I caught the metallic tang of old blood. It was a nest, or the entrance to one. Jagged ribs arched off from the main tunnel into branching arteries of darkness. Steeling myself, I leaned in and shone my light into the aperture. The recesses of the cavern were littered with bones. Some bleached with age, others still oozing strings of marrow and gristle. Skulls peered eyelessly from every nook and alcove. Human skulls. Picked clean and gnawed. Bile seared the back of my throat. I fought the urge to scream, to turn and sprint for the exit. But I forced my trembling legs to carry me across the threshold, playing my light over the nightmarish charnel house. Looking for any scrap of bright cloth or synthetic material that could belong to I forced myself to scan the Wendigo's lair methodically, playing my flashlight beam over the bone-strewn floor and blood-encrusted walls. Trying not to think about the mind-shattering horror of what had happened here, of the fates of the poor hikers whose remains now decorated this nightmarish charnel house. "There!" Liza's voice cracked on the word. She was pointing a shaking finger toward a recess on the far side of the cavern. I swung my light over, dread and hope warring in my chest. Tucked into the alcove was the bright blue of a backpack. The same one we had found abandoned in the clearing yesterday. And huddled behind it, just visible in the gloom, was a human form. Still and crumpled, limbs splayed at wrong angles. I scrambled over, slipping on the layer of bones and ichor coating the floor. I braced myself for the worst as I knelt beside the unmoving hiker. A young woman, her skin waxy and mottled in the flashlight's glare. Drying blood matted her hair and clothes. But then I saw her chest rise with a shallow, rattling breath. She was alive. Barely. "It's okay, we're here to help," I soothed, taking one limp hand to check for a pulse. It was thready and faint. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she let out a low moan. Her gaze was glassy and unfocused, like she wasn't fully registering our presence. "What happened?" Jake asked gently, kneeling beside me. "Who did this to you?" Hunger," the hiker breathed. Her voice was a dry rasp. Liza passed me a water bottle, and I held it to the woman's cracked lips. She took a sip and coughed weakly. "The hunger found me. In the woods." Each word seemed to take tremendous effort. So ravenous, insatiable, couldn't escape. A chill rippled through me at her broken recollection. So the Wendigo had been stalking her, toying with her, striking with that hypnotic hunger when she was isolated and vulnerable. But some small, rational part of my brain was still struggling to make sense of the impossible scene surrounding us, to fit the existence of such a horrific creature into my worldview. "What exactly attacked you?" I asked, hating myself for pressing her but needing to know. "A man? An animal? Can you describe it?" The hiker's eyes widened, her breath coming faster. "Not man, not animal, something in between. Gaunt, emaciated, but strong. So strong." She shuddered, fresh tears cutting trails through the grime on her face. Teeth like knives, claws, sunken eyes that pull you in, drags you into its hunger, into its need. Revulsion shuddered through me at the broken description. At the impossible truth I could no longer deny. The Wendigo was real. This woman had seen it, been preyed upon by it. And our worst fears had come to pass. We were now trapped in its lair, its hunting ground. I exchanged a horrified look with Jake and Liza. Saw my own building terror reflected back at me. The hiker's words had shattered any last illusions of safety, of control. We were locked in a concrete tomb with a nightmare made flesh. A ravenous, predatory thing that wore a twisted mockery of a human face. We had to get out. Now. Before we joined the boneyard relics of the creature's previous victims, as carefully as I could, I gathered the injured woman into my arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body wasted and frail. Jake and Liza took up defensive positions on either side, flashlights probing the darkness. Step by painstaking step, we began to creep back toward the tunnel entrance. Every drip of water from the ceiling, every crunch of bone shards underfoot made me flinch. My heart hammered against my ribs hard enough to hurt, because I knew it was only a matter of time before the Wendigo caught our scent again, before that insatiable famine spirit closed in to reclaim its prey. And this time it would have 4 walking meals instead of 1. The journey back through the mine shaft was a bleak eternity of sickening anticipation, stretched thinner than spider silk. Darkness pressed down with a suffocating weight, the narrow beam of my flashlight feeble comfort. Ragged breaths and pounding hearts thundered in the confined space. But it was the waiting, the watching that truly tormented. My nerve endings seared and jangled, braced for a glimpse of gaunt, grasping limbs, of feral, luminous eyes and jutting knife-like teeth leering out of the black. How long could a hunger that immense, that insatiable, resist the promise of meat stumbling obliviously through its larder? Jake and Liza flanked me like an honor guard as I carried the semi-lucid hiker. Any time she drifted into consciousness, it was never for long. A second's clutch of flailing limbs, a panicked cry soon tapering into wounded animal whimpers. I didn't blame her. Part of me wanted to gibber in shriek denial of the gibbering violation of natural law we'd discovered. To claw out my eyes so I'd never have to see those stripped bones and blood-stained stones again. But I crushed those hysterical impulses with the weight of duty, of training, of the callous discipline that had carried me through other inhuman wilds, if never this depraved. If we gave in to the fear, let it shatter our minds, then the Wendigo had already won. 1 foot, then the next, then the next. Footing unsure on the sloping, graveled floor. Ignore protesting muscles, the chafing weapon harness. Ignore the rivulets of frigid sweat and the crawling nape hairs shrieking danger. Just keep moving. Almost there, Jake said in a hoarse undertone, raw with false confidence. Entrance should be just after this bend. I heard the yearning behind the words, the desperate, disbelieving hope that we'd somehow sneak past the evil crouching in this forsaken tunnel, escape its fetid tomb without a second encounter. But as we rounded the final curve, that wan prayer dissolved like mist beneath a blowtorch. Because crouched in the very center of the shaft, between us and the promised salvation of open sky, was the Wendigo. For a breathless, blood-frozen moment, I couldn't make sense of the twisted shape splayed before us. All wrong angles and emaciated limbs, more skeleton than flesh. Then the creature shifted and light glinted across its form, outlining it in obscene clarity. Skin the gray-green of spoiled meat stretched drum-tight across jutting ribs and knobs of spine. Arms and legs like gnarled tree roots tipped with scythe-like claws. A head that was little more than a grinning skull mask haloed by wispy, graying hair. But worst of all were its eyes. Bulging from sunken sockets, they held a feral, insatiable gleam. The ravenous, single-minded focus of a rabid wolf scenting a haunch of meat. I saw our reflections shining in those hideous orbs. 4 terror-struck human faces superimposed over the descending tunnel. Over the creature's previous victims, now nothing more than cracked bones and gristle. Stay back. Liza's voice trembled on the edge of hysteria as she brandished her flashlight like a weapon. Pitiful defense against the nightmare poised before us. The Wendigo unfolded to its full height with a creak of sinew and bone. Arms spread wide, claws scything trails through the stale air. A rattling hiss seeped from between its needle teeth, building to a soul-flaying shriek of famine and fury. Then, in a clash of splintered reality and skittering limbs, it lunged. Time fractured into a fever dream slide of blood and terror. Of fanning flashlights and skidding gravel, panicked shouts rendered tinny and distant by the crash of my own pulse. I felt the breath punch from my lungs as Jake shouldered me aside, shoving the barely conscious hiker and I sprawling against the shaft wall. Heard Liza's cracking scream devolve into a wet, hitching gurgle. The Wendigo was among us before we could draw another breath. A whirlwind of grasping claws and gnashing teeth, its movements spastic yet horribly graceful, driven by a hunger that could never be sated. I hunched over the mewling hiker, shielding her with my body. Even as revulsion shuddered through me at the sounds of rending flesh and splintering bone, the grisly crack crunch of snapping limbs. Liza's thrashing body hurtled past in my peripheral vision, ragdoll limp. She struck the wall and crumpled, her neck twisted at a grotesque angle. The flashlight spun crazily, flickering across the writhing bulk of the Wendigo as it fell upon Jake. He screamed, a high, animalistic sound that seared into my brain, then went abruptly, wetly silent. In the guttering strobe, I caught glimpses of the creature at its gory work, of flashing teeth and talons painting the walls in abstract splatters of crimson and bile. Glistening ropes of viscera unspooled into the darkness. The scent of fresh blood mingled with reek of decay, of centuries-old carnage now replenished with new meat. Nausea coiled around my windpipe, squeezed. My hands shook as I fumbled for the flare gun, the hiker keening beneath me. Tears and snot slicked my face, blurred my vision. With numb fingers, I managed to yank the launcher clear of my belt, wrenched the barrel skyward as the Wendigo reared up from Jake's twitching remains. Grinning death's head haloed in hellish light. Those hungry, inhuman eyes found me cowering against the wall, widened in malicious, triumphant glee. I saw my own insignificance reflected in that gaze. The futility of thinking I could challenge a timeless evil that had stalked these woods for generations. An insatiable presence too vicious, too primal, to be stopped by mortal hands. The Wendigo gathered itself to spring, fanged maw yawning impossibly wide. Clotted gobbets of my friend's flesh clung to its jutting teeth. With a sob, I squeezed the flare gun's trigger. Let the searing magnesium brilliance scorch away the advancing horror of the creature's twisted visage. The flare impacted the Wendigo square in its emaciated chest with a mighty whoomp of igniting chemicals. Acrid smoke belched from the wound, chased by tongues of crimson fire. An ungodly shriek rent the air, agony and rage entwined. The Wendigo reeled back, skeletal limbs pinwheeling, tattered skin crisping and curling like burning paper. Hope surged through me, dizzying. Had the mystical fire actually hurt the creature, driven it back? But as the flare sputtered out, I saw the Wendigo still standing, still advancing with implacable, lurching strides. Charred flesh sloughed from its torso, revealing glistening sinew and yellowed rib bones beneath. The wounds sealed over with liquid grace, leaving only a few wisps of smoke behind. Despair crashed over me, heavy as a gravestone. What chance did we really have against a thing that healed from magnesium burns in seconds? A ravenous spirit that had preyed on human flesh for centuries. The Wendigo loomed over me, its fetid breath hot on my face. I clutched the whimpering, semi-conscious hiker, squeezing my eyes shut, preparing for the first slash of talon and fang. But the killing blow never fell. A blinding explosion of light and heat washed across my huddled form. Sulphurous wind shrieked down the tunnel, whipping my hair into a frenzy. I squinted into the maelstrom, barely able to make out the Wendigo silhouetted against the tunnel entrance. Bony arms upraised against the gale, its cadaverous profile eaten away by brilliant, searing luminance. The smell of gasoline cut through the reek of gore and decay. Orange tongues of flame danced at the edges of the unnatural radiance, consuming rotted support timbers and fungi-fuzzed mining equipment. Someone had lit the whole damn shaft entrance on fire. A second blazing projectile arced out of the inferno, trailing a comet tail of flame. Napalm pounded into the Wendigo's chest, clinging and burning with chemical fury. The creature spasmed and howled, immolating flesh sloughing from its bones. Oily black smoke billowed up as the monster crumbled like a paper doll in a furnace. Over the crackle and roar of the fire, I heard a strong baritone chanting. The Algonquin words thrummed with ancient power, each syllable a tolling bell. At the tunnel mouth, wreathed in smoke and flame, stood the old native man from the trail. His weathered face shone with righteous wrath, teeth bared in a snarl as he hurled burning bundles of sage and sweet grass. As the last word of the banishing chant left the elder's lips, a soundless detonation rippled through the cavern. A shockwave of cleansing heat and searing, spirit-bright luminance. I flinched away, shielding the hiker as the horrible, famine-hollowed scream of the Wendigo reached a brain-shattering crescendo, then abruptly cut off. When I could finally blink the tears from my eyes and raise my head, the creature was gone. Only a few hanks of charred, empty skin remained, along with the blackened suggestion of a ribcage. The ancient evil had been driven out. Burned away by ancestral fire and banishing rituals, the tunnel purged and cleansed. I stared at the old man in stunned disbelief as he limped towards me, a sad, weary smile on his face. The hiker stirred in my arms, letting out a thin, pitiful groan. "Come," the native elder said gently, extending a soot-stained hand. "Let's get you out of this place of sorrow and death." Wordlessly, I let him help me to my feet, still cradling the semi-conscious woman. Let him lead us, step by stumbling step, out of the charnel shadows and into the clean, smoke-hazed light of day. The Wendigo was gone, its insatiable hunger vanquished at last. But as relief crashed over me in shuddering waves, I knew I would never see this forest the same way again. Never escape the ghosts of the friends I'd lost, or the knowledge of what slept beneath these ancient, shadowed boughs. The legends were true. There were monsters in the dark, and for a handful of blood-soaked moments we had walked among them, had witnessed the depthless famine and feral madness that had stalked these woods for generations. It was an understanding I would carry for the rest of my life, seared into my mind, my bones. A horrific communion no one should ever have to bear. But we had survived. Against all odds, we had faced the Wendigo, and lived. And that was a bitter triumph I could only pray would never be tested again. I never planned to become a serious hiker. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, the closest I got to nature was our meticulously maintained backyard and the occasional school field trip to local parks. But everything changed during my sophomore year of college when my roommate Dave convinced me to join the university's hiking club. "Come on, Mark," he'd said, tossing his worn Osprey backpack onto his bed. "You spend too much time in the computer lab. One weekend won't kill you." That first trip was to the Berkshires, nothing too challenging, just a day hike up Mount Greylock. I remember standing at the summit, watching the autumn clouds cast moving shadows across the valley below, and feeling something shift inside me. The world seemed bigger somehow, more real than the artificial environment of lecture halls and fluorescent-lit corridors. After graduation, while my classmates were pursuing careers in finance and tech, I took a job as an environmental consultant in Portland, Oregon. The position paid less than what my degree in environmental science could have commanded in the private sector, but it gave me something more valuable: proximity to some of the most beautiful hiking trails in the country. Over the next 5 years, I built a life around the outdoors. My weekends were spent exploring the Pacific Crest Trail, mapping out new routes through Mount Hood National Forest, or leading guided hikes for local conservation groups. That's how I met Sarah and Mike, a married couple who shared my passion for the backcountry. Sarah was a wildlife photographer, and Mike worked as a park ranger. They became my closest friends, the kind of people you could spend hours with around a campfire, sharing stories and planning future adventures. The trip that changed everything started as a simple idea during one of our regular Thursday night dinners at Sarah and Mike's place. We were looking at Sarah's recent photos from the Wallowa Mountains when Mike mentioned an old logging trail he'd heard about from one of the senior rangers. "It's not on any official maps," he said, spreading out a topographical survey across their dining room table. But according to Tom, there's an old Forest Service cabin up there that hasn't been logged in the database. Could make for an interesting weekend expedition. I leaned over the map, tracing the faint pencil line Mike had drawn. The trail branched off from a main hiking route about 15 miles into the wilderness, following what looked like an ancient riverbed before disappearing into an unmarked section of the forest. "What's the elevation gain?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her camera gear. "About 3,000 feet over 7 miles, Mike replied. "But the real challenge is that no one's maintained the trail in decades. We'd be bushwhacking most of the way." We spent the next 2 weeks preparing meticulously. Mike pulled satellite imagery of the area, looking for natural landmarks we could use to navigate. Sarah researched local wildlife patterns. There had been increased bear activity in the region that season. I focused on our supplies, making sure we had enough emergency equipment to handle anything from a broken ankle to an unexpected storm. The night before we left, I double-checked my pack one final time. Topographical maps and compass, emergency satellite phone, first aid kit with extra supplies, 3 days of dehydrated meals, water filtration system, cold weather gear, headlamp with spare batteries, emergency shelter, bear spray. Everything looked perfect, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the autumn wind rattled my apartment windows, or maybe it was just pre-trip jitters. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something we weren't prepared for. We left Portland before dawn, Mike's Jeep loaded with our gear. The drive to the trailhead took 3 hours, the last 45 minutes on a dirt road that tested the vehicle's suspension. The morning was crisp, with thin clouds stretching across the sky like pulled cotton. Perfect hiking weather. The first few miles followed a well-maintained trail, winding through old-growth forest. The canopy above was so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor in distinct beams, like spotlights illuminating patches of moss and ferns. Sarah stopped occasionally to photograph interesting fungi or unique tree formations, while Mike consulted his GPS to ensure we stayed on course. "This is where it gets interesting," Mike said around noon, pointing to where the main trail curved east while our route continued north. The difference was immediate and striking. The path ahead was barely visible, choked with undergrowth and fallen trees. The forest felt different here too. Older somehow, more primeval. We pushed through thick brush, using hiking poles to test the ground ahead of us. The atmosphere grew heavier as we progressed, the air becoming noticeably cooler despite the afternoon sun. The usual forest sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, chattering squirrels, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had noticed. The silence felt almost physical, like a weight pressing against my ears. Even our footsteps seemed oddly muffled, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs strangely distant. The first sign that something was wrong came around 3 in the afternoon. We had stopped for a water break when Mike spotted something unusual, a series of deep gouges in a nearby tree trunk about 7 feet off the ground. "Bear marks?" Sarah asked, raising her camera. Mike shook his head slowly. "Too high, and the pattern's wrong. Bears leave vertical scratches. These are..." He traced the air in front of the marks. Almost geometric. I moved closer to examine the tree. The gouges were deep, cutting through the bark into the pale wood beneath. They formed an odd pattern. 3 parallel lines intersected by 2 diagonal cuts. The edges were clean, almost surgical in their precision. "Could be human," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. "Loggers marking trees, maybe?" "With what tool?" Mike countered. "And why just this one tree?" We continued hiking, but the discovery had changed something in our dynamic. We walked closer together, spoke less, and found ourselves constantly scanning the forest around us. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more active somehow, as if they were shifting independently of the swaying branches above. The old logging road appeared suddenly, emerging from the undergrowth like the ghost of civilization. Decades of neglect had reduced it to little more than a slightly wider gap between the trees, but its straight lines were unmistakably human-made. As we followed it deeper into the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the mist that had been gathering all afternoon began to thicken. That's when we found the first artifact, a rusted axe head half buried in the soil. Mike dug it out carefully, turning it over in his hands. The metal was pitted with age, but there was something odd about its shape. The blade curved at an unusual angle, and strange symbols were etched into its surface. "Those don't look like any manufacturer's marks I've ever seen," Mike said, handing me the axe head. The symbols seemed to shift as I examined them, like optical illusions that changed when viewed from different angles. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I quickly passed the artifact to Sarah. We found more items as we continued. Fragments of old tools, pieces of machinery consumed by rust, and occasionally stranger things. Objects whose purpose we couldn't begin to guess. Each discovery added to the growing sense that we had stumbled into something we weren't meant to find. The cabin appeared through the mist just as the sun was setting. It was larger than we'd expected, a 2-story structure built from massive old-growth logs. But something was wrong with its proportions. The angles seemed slightly off, as if it had been built according to some alien geometry. "This can't be the Forest Service cabin," Mike said, consulting his map. "We're at least a mile from where it should be." Before anyone could respond, we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any forest I knew. It started as a low vibration, more felt than heard, then built into a humming tone that made my teeth ache. The mist around us began to move in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. Sarah's camera clicked rapidly as a shape emerged from between the trees. At first, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It seemed to shift and flow, its form refusing to settle into anything recognizable. Then it stepped into a patch of fading sunlight, and I felt my sanity strain. The creature was tall, at least 9 feet, but its height seemed to fluctuate as it moved. Its body was covered in what looked like bark, but the patterns swirled and changed like oil on water. Where its face should have been, there was a complex arrangement of angles and curves that hurt to look at directly. Long, jointed limbs, too many of them, moved with an unsettling grace. We ran. There was no discussion, no coordinated plan. Primitive instinct took over, and we fled in blind panic. I could hear it behind us, moving through the forest with impossible speed. Trees creaked and groaned as it passed, and that horrible humming grew louder. Sarah screamed. I turned to see her trip on an exposed root, her camera flying from her hands. Mike and I rushed back to help her up, but the creature was almost upon us. In the deepening darkness, its form seemed to blend with the shadows, making it impossible to tell where the forest ended and the entity began. Mike pushed us behind him and raised the bear spray. The creature hesitated, cocking its non-head in what might have been curiosity. Then it made a sound, not the humming from before, but a series of clicks and whistles that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The forest floor erupted with pale, thread-like growths that reached for our feet. Mike deployed the bear spray, creating a temporary barrier of caustic mist between us and the entity. We ran again, this time staying together, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. The humming had faded, but we couldn't be sure if we'd lost the creature or if it had simply grown tired of chasing us. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, nothing in the forest looked familiar. "Anyone still have their pack?" Mike gasped out. We had all lost our gear during the chase. Sarah's camera was gone, along with all our supplies and emergency equipment. We still had our flashlights and the clothes on our backs, but that was it. "The satellite phone," Sarah said between breaths. "It was in my pocket." She pulled it out, but the screen was cracked and dark. Dead. We spent hours stumbling through the darkness, using our flashlights sparingly to conserve batteries. The forest seemed to shift around us, landmarks appearing and disappearing, paths leading in circles. Several times we heard that distinctive humming in the distance, and once we saw lights moving between the trees, not flashlights, but something that pulsed with an organic rhythm. Dawn was breaking when we finally found the main trail. We practically ran the last few miles to the trailhead, our relief at seeing Mike's Jeep mixed with lingering terror that the creature might make one final appearance. The immediate aftermath was a blur of police reports and hospital visits. Sarah had sprained her ankle during the fall, and we all had numerous cuts and bruises from our headlong flight through the forest. The official report listed us as having gotten lost after dark and panicked. They found some of our abandoned gear but claimed there was no sign of the cabin or any unusual markings on the trees. The long-term effects were more subtle but far-reaching. None of us slept well for months. I developed a persistent tremor in my hands that doctors couldn't explain. Sarah stopped doing wildlife photography, eventually switching to studio work. Mike requested a transfer to an urban park, leaving his backcountry duties behind. We tried to research what we had encountered, spending countless hours in libraries and online forums. We found scattered references to similar experiences in the area dating back to the early logging days. Stories of geometric markings on trees, unexplained structures, and encounters with something that defied description. Most had been dismissed as logging camp tales or hallucinations brought on by isolation. 6 months after our encounter, Sarah's damaged camera was found by another hiking group, miles from where she had dropped it. Most of the photos were corrupted, but a few remained intact. They showed the tree with its geometric scarring, the strange axe head with its shifting symbols, and a single blurry image of something tall and dark moving between the trees. The police claimed the photos were too damaged to be conclusive evidence of anything. Other stories began to reach us. A graduate student doing field research in the area disappeared for 3 days, then walked out of the forest with no memory of what had happened. Hunters reported unusual patterns of animal behavior, with entire sections of the forest seemingly devoid of wildlife. Park rangers found more geometric markings on trees, always in the same precise pattern we had seen. It's been 2 years since our encounter in those woods. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that part of the forest. The tremor in my hands comes and goes, usually worse when I think about what we saw. Sarah and Mike have moved to Colorado, putting as much distance as they can between themselves and those memories. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I pull out the single photo I kept, the one showing the geometric marks on the tree. The pattern seems different each time I look at it, though I know that's impossible. I've learned to live with the knowledge that something ancient and utterly alien shares our world, hiding in the deep woods where the old growth trees block out the sun. But what haunts me most isn't the memory of the creature itself, or even the thought that it might still be out there. It's the question that keeps me awake at night. Did we simply stumble upon something that had always been there, or did our presence somehow draw it out? And if it was drawn to us, what made us special? What made us worthy of its attention? I don't hike that trail anymore. But sometimes, when the wind blows from the north and carries with it the scent of old-growth pine, I catch myself straining to hear that distinctive humming. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, wants to go back, to understand what we encountered. The rest of me knows better. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some knowledge comes at too high a price. The forest keeps its secrets, and maybe for our own sake, that's how it should stay. You know, life has a funny way of reminding you that you're not in control as much as you'd like to think. Just when I thought I had things all figured out, it decided to throw me a curveball. I remember it vividly, that day when everything changed. It was supposed to be a relaxing RV camping trip to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Little did I know, it would become a fight for survival. I've always enjoyed the solitude of nature, the peace and quiet that comes with being far from the city's noise. My RV was parked at a secluded spot in Blackwood National Forest, nestled deep in the heart of Montana. This place was perfect. Dense trees, a crystal-clear stream nearby, and not a soul in sight. I was looking forward to a week of fishing, hiking, and maybe a bit of reading by the campfire. My name is Alex Morgan, and I'm a 35-year-old software developer from Seattle. After a particularly stressful project at work, I decided to take some time off and reconnect with nature. I'd always been an outdoors enthusiast, but the demands of my career had kept me chained to my desk for far too long. This trip was meant to be my reset button, a chance to clear my head and recharge my batteries. As I set up camp on that first day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with trepidation. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. It was a stark contrast to the sterile environment of my office, and I found myself taking deep breaths, savoring the change. I spent the first couple of days settling into a rhythm. I'd wake up early, brew a pot of coffee on my portable stove, and watch the mist rise from the nearby stream as the sun peeked through the trees. Then I'd grab my fishing rod and try my luck in the clear waters, more often than not managing to catch something for dinner. In the afternoons, I'd explore the surrounding forest, taking care to mark my trail so I wouldn't get lost. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled trunks and sprawling canopies creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. I found myself speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of this place. As night fell, I'd return to my campsite, build a fire, and lose myself in the pages of a book I'd brought along, a collection of horror stories by H.P. Lovecraft. In retrospect, perhaps not the best choice for a solo camping trip in the wilderness, but I've always enjoyed a good scare. Little did I know that real horror was lurking just beyond the flickering light of my campfire. It was on the third day that things took a turn for the strange. I had spent the morning fishing and was making my way back to camp when I noticed something odd. A metallic glint caught my eye, coming from the underbrush across the stream. Curiosity piqued, I carefully made my way across the water, my boots slipping on the moss-covered rocks. Pushing through the dense foliage, I came upon an old, rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years, the metal corroded and covered in a thick layer of grime. I pulled it out, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What could be inside? Lost treasure? Old mementos? Or something more sinister? Using a rock, I managed to pry open the box. Inside, I found a collection of items that seemed to belong to another time. There were faded photographs, yellowed with age, showing a young couple. They were smiling and happy, clearly in love. The man had a rugged, outdoorsy look about him, with a thick beard and piercing eyes. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and a carefree smile that seemed to light up the frame. Along with the photos, there were a few letters. The paper was fragile, and the ink had faded, making them difficult to read. But from what I could make out, they were love letters, filled with passionate declarations and promises of eternal devotion. The handwriting was elegant, speaking of a time when penmanship was valued and taught with care. But it was the small leather-bound notebook that really caught my attention. The cover was worn and cracked, but the pages inside were still intact. As I flipped through it, I realized it was a journal, filled with handwritten entries detailing the couple's adventures in this very forest. The entries started off innocently enough, describing hikes and camping trips, wildlife sightings, and quiet moments by the campfire. But as I read on, the tone began to change. The writer, who I assumed was the man from the photographs, began to describe strange occurrences. One entry, dated June 17, 1978, stood out. June 17, 1978. Something's not right in these woods. For the past few nights, Emily and I have been hearing strange noises after dark. At first, we thought it was just animals, but it's different. There's a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps, but not quite. And the feeling of being watched is constant now. Emily's scared, though she tries not to show it. I told her it's nothing, but I'm not so sure anymore. Last night, I saw something. A figure, just at the edge of our campsite. It was too dark to make out clearly, but it was tall, unnaturally so. When I shined my flashlight in that direction, it was gone. I didn't tell Emily. No need to frighten her more. We're leaving tomorrow. I love these woods, but something tells me we're not welcome here anymore. The entry ended there, and as I turned the page, expecting to find more, I was met with blank pages. The journal entries stopped abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. The sun, which had been high in the sky when I found the box, was now dipping towards the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just hours ago, now felt oppressive and watchful. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over me. It was just an old story, probably embellished for effect. People loved to tell tales about spooky encounters in the woods. It didn't mean anything. Still, as I made my way back to my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The birds, which had been singing all day, were now eerily silent. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. By the time I got back to my RV, darkness had fallen. I quickly built a fire, its warm light providing a small circle of comfort in the growing gloom. As I sat down to cook the fish I'd caught earlier, I found my eyes constantly darting to the tree line, searching for... what? A tall figure? A pair of watching eyes? I laughed nervously at myself. "Get a grip, Alex," I muttered. "It's just a story. You're letting your imagination run wild." But as the night deepened, the forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Normal nighttime sounds, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Yet there was something else. A subtle but persistent feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself growing tenser by the minute. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter of my camp, its beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I tried to relax, focusing on my dinner and the warmth of the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a presence just beyond the reach of my senses. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping, close by. Too close. I froze, flashlight in hand, and slowly turned towards the sound. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. No response came, just the quiet crackle of my campfire and the distant hoot of an owl. I sat back down, more alert now, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond my little circle of light. Minutes felt like hours as I strained my ears for any unusual sound. Just when I started to relax, convinced I was letting the journal story get to me, I heard it again. Another snap, even closer this time. I stood up, this time with my hunting knife in hand, and shined the light into the darkness. Still nothing. But the forest was different now. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement just beyond the reach of the light. I aimed the beam in that direction and caught a glimpse of something slipping behind a tree. My pulse quickened. This was no animal. The movement was too deliberate, too human. I kept the light trained on the spot and called out again, louder this time. "Show yourself!" Silence answered me, but the tension in the air grew thicker. I backed up towards my RV, never taking my eyes off the tree line. Another movement caught my attention, this time to my left. I swung the light around, and there, partially hidden by the shadows, stood a man. He was tall, unnaturally so, just like the figure described in the journal. His build was lean, almost emaciated, and he wore tattered clothes that looked like they'd been through hell. But it was his face that sent a jolt of terror through me. Gaunt and pale, with sunken cheeks and wild, feverish eyes, he looked more like a corpse than a living man. Those eyes, glinting in the flashlight's beam, held a mixture of madness and malevolence that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I demanded, knife at the ready, though I doubted it would be much use if he decided to attack. He stepped forward, just enough for me to see him more clearly. A sinister smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that were yellow and rotting. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to echo in the quiet forest. "This is public land," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I have every right to be here. Now who are you and what do you want?" His smile widened, and I saw something dark and sticky on his teeth. I prayed it was just poor dental hygiene, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. "You found the box, didn't you?" he asked, taking another step closer. I hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. "Yes. What of it?" "You should have left it buried," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Now you're involved." "Involved in what?" I asked, my grip tightening on the knife. "In what happened to them," he replied, gesturing vaguely towards the forest. "In what's been happening here for decades." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My heart was racing, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone, cursing when I saw there was no signal. With shaking hands, I grabbed my keys and started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, I saw him again, standing in front of the RV, blocking my path. His expression was one of cold determination, and I knew with certainty that he had no intention of letting me leave. I honked the horn, a long, angry blast that echoed through the forest. He didn't budge. Desperation clawed at me as I realized I was trapped. The RV suddenly felt claustrophobic, and I knew I couldn't stay here. Making a split-second decision, I floored the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, and at the last second the man moved, avoiding the impact. But I didn't stop to see where he went. I drove down the narrow, winding road as fast as I dared, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses to my terror. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him chasing after me, moving with that unnatural speed that only exists in nightmares. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the road widened enough for me to turn around. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and decided to head back to the main highway, leaving the campsite and all my gear behind. I didn't care about any of it anymore. All I wanted was to get out of those woods and back to civilization. The man's words echoed in my mind. "You're involved." I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, that I'd stumbled into something far bigger and more terrifying than a simple camping trip gone wrong. The headlights picked up a sign pointing towards the highway, and I felt a surge of relief. Just a few more miles and I'd be out of this nightmare. But life, as I mentioned earlier, has a way of reminding you that you're not in control. Just as I thought I was safe, something heavy slammed into the side of the RV. The impact was so sudden and violent that I lost control of the vehicle. It skidded off the road, tires screeching against the asphalt. I fought to regain control, but it was useless. The RV tipped and crashed into a ditch with a sickening crunch of metal and breaking glass. The world spun around me, a kaleidoscope of darkness and pain. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the RV, dazed and disoriented. Pain shot through my body, and I could taste blood in my mouth. The interior of the RV was a mess, with broken glass and scattered belongings everywhere. I tried to move, to assess the damage, but my body protested. Every inch of me ached, and I was pretty sure I had at least a few broken ribs. The metallic tang of blood filled my nostrils, mixed with the acrid smell of leaking gasoline. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the RV. My heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop altogether. I knew who it was before I saw him. The door, which had been dented inward from the crash, was suddenly ripped open with inhuman strength. And there he stood, silhouetted against the night sky, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "You shouldn't have run," he snarled, reaching in and dragging me out into the cold night air. I tried to fight back, to resist, but my limbs felt like lead. He threw me to the ground, and I landed hard, the impact driving what little air I had left from my lungs. "You should have left well enough alone," he continued, looming over me. "But now you're part of it, just like they were." I struggled to my feet, my vision blurry and my mind reeling. "What do you want from me?" I gasped, tasting blood with every word. His lips curled into that twisted smile again. "Justice," he replied. "For them. For all of them." He pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. It looked old, possibly as old as the box I'd found in the woods. I knew then that this was it. If I didn't act now, I'd end up like the couple from the photos, another victim of whatever madness plagued these woods. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him. The move caught him off guard, and we grappled, the knife between us. My survival instincts kicked in, overriding the pain and fear. In that moment, nothing mattered except getting that knife. We struggled, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. He was strong, unnaturally so, but desperation lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, miraculously, I managed to wrench the knife from his grip. Without thinking, driven purely by the instinct to survive, I drove the blade into his side. He let out a strangled cry, more of surprise than pain, and staggered back. Blood, dark and viscous, oozed between his fingers as he clutched the wound. He sank to his knees, those wild eyes now filled with a mixture of pain and... was that relief? For a moment, we stared at each other, both of us panting heavily. Then, to my utter shock, he began to laugh. It was a terrible sound, a wheezing, broken noise that sent chills down my spine. "You don't understand," he gasped between bursts of laughter. "This changes nothing. You're still part of it now. They'll come for you, just like they came for me." I didn't wait to hear more. Clutching my injured ribs, I stumbled back to the RV. By some miracle, the engine sputtered to life when I turned the key. I threw it into reverse, wincing at the screech of metal as the vehicle pulled itself free from the ditch. As I drove away, I could still hear his laughter echoing through the trees. I kept expecting him to appear in my rearview mirror, but he never did. The winding forest road seemed endless, each turn revealing more darkness, more trees that all looked the same in the dim headlights. It felt like hours before I finally saw the lights of civilization. The small town of Millbrook appeared like an oasis in the desert. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the RV in park. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a kind face, took one look at me and called the police. Within minutes, the quiet gas station was a flurry of activity. Police cars, an ambulance, curious onlookers. It was all a blur. I told my story to the police, watching their expressions change from skepticism to concern. They took my statement and immediately sent units to investigate the forest and the crash site. The paramedics patched me up, confirming my suspicions about the broken ribs and adding a concussion to the list of injuries. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital rooms, police interviews, and sleepless nights. They found the crash site, my abandoned campsite, even the old metal box with its contents. But of the strange man, there was no sign, no body, no blood trail. Nothing to corroborate my story except the knife wound in my side that the doctors said was defensive. The case was eventually classified as self-defense against an unknown assailant, likely a drifter or escaped mental patient, they said. I was free to go, to return to my life in Seattle. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. In the months that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. I returned to work, to my comfortable apartment, to the rhythms of city life. But the forest never truly left me. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the man's laughter ringing in my ears. I'd see tall, gaunt figures out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. And then the dreams started. Vivid, terrifying dreams of running through endless woods, of voices whispering from the shadows, of hands reaching out to grab me. In these dreams, I'd often find myself back at that campsite, staring at the old metal box. But when I opened it, instead of photos and letters, I'd find only darkness. A darkness that seemed to go on forever, threatening to swallow me whole. I've thought a lot about that trip, about the man and his obsession with the past, about the couple in the photos and what might have happened to them. Maybe he was right. Maybe I should have left the box buried, should have never set foot in those woods. But curiosity is a powerful force, and sometimes it leads us down paths we can never truly leave. I haven't been back to Blackwood National Forest since that night. Maybe one day I will, to face whatever is waiting for me there. But not today. Not yet. For now, I'm content with the memories of a peaceful camping trip that turned into a fight for my life. I've taken up writing, putting my experiences down on paper in an attempt to make sense of them. It helps sometimes. Other times it feels like I'm just inviting the darkness in. As I sit here, typing these words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere, in the shadows just beyond my perception, something is waiting. Waiting for me to let my guard down. To forget what happened in those woods. But I won't forget. I can't. Because deep down, I know the truth that I've been trying to deny all these months. The man in the forest was right. I'm involved now. And whatever dwells in the shadows of Blackwood Forest isn't finished with me yet. Sometimes late at night when the city sleeps and the world grows quiet, I swear I can hear it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, calling me back to the woods. And in those moments, I wonder not if, but when I'll answer that call, because the forest is patient, and now, so am I. I woke up that morning with a sense of unease. Something about the quiet was off, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart pound a little harder. My name's Gregory Holt, and I'd driven out to the middle of nowhere in an RV, hoping to get some peace and quiet. Life had been a series of endless loops, a carousel of monotony that I desperately needed to step off. At 42, I was burned out from my job as a software engineer in bustling Chicago. The constant deadlines, the office politics, and the feeling that I was just another cog in a massive, soulless machine had taken their toll. My relationships had suffered too, a string of failed romances and friendships that had withered under the weight of my workaholic tendencies. So I'd taken a sabbatical, packed up my newly purchased RV, and headed north. The campsite was perfect, nestled in the thick woods of northern Michigan. It was isolated enough that you couldn't hear any traffic, just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. I had my chair set up by the fire pit, and the coffee was brewing on the small stove inside the RV. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the crisp morning air, creating a sensory experience that was both invigorating and calming. As I sat there, sipping my coffee and watching the early morning mist rise from the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, or perhaps my city dweller instincts were on high alert in this wilderness setting. Whatever it was, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to rationalize it away. After all, isn't this what I came here for? The silence, the solitude, the chance to reset my overworked mind. I took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through my body, hoping it would chase away the chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. My routine started with a morning hike. The path I'd chosen was well-trodden but still wild, the kind where you could easily believe you were the first person to step foot there in years. As I set out, my boots crunching on the leaf-strewn path, I tried to focus on the beauty around me rather than the nagging sense of disquiet that seemed to have taken up residence in my gut. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Chickadees called to each other in the canopy above, while a woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the woods. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soothing whisper that seemed to encourage me forward. Despite my unease, I found myself drawn deeper into the forest, curiosity overriding caution. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was fresh, with that earthy smell that only a forest can have, a mixture of damp soil, decaying leaves, and pine needles. It was a scent that seemed to awaken something primal within me, a connection to nature that had been dormant during my years in the concrete jungle of Chicago. I was about an hour into my hike when the path took an unexpected turn. The well-worn trail I had been following suddenly became less distinct, as if fewer feet had tread this way. The underbrush grew thicker, and I had to push aside low-hanging branches to make progress. Just as I was considering turning back, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, but there was something oddly compelling about it. The cabin was a relic of a bygone era, its weathered logs speaking of decades, if not centuries, of history. The roof sagged ominously, covered in a thick blanket of moss and lichen. The door hung off its hinges, and the windows were shattered, giving it a skeletal look. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I couldn't help but imagine the stories this cabin could tell. Who had built it? Who had lived here, so far from civilization? And why had they abandoned it to the relentless march of nature? The floorboards of the small porch creaked ominously under my weight as I stepped up to the entrance. I paused at the threshold, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Part of me knew I should turn back, that exploring abandoned buildings in the middle of nowhere was the kind of thing that led to trouble. But another part, the part that had driven me out here in search of something different, something real, urged me forward. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Shafts of sunlight streamed through holes in the roof and the broken windows, illuminating motes of dust that swirled in the air, disturbed by my entrance. The musty smell of decay and abandonment assaulted my nostrils, making me wrinkle my nose in disgust. Old furniture was strewn about, victims of time and neglect. A rickety table stood in what must have been the main living area, one leg broken and lying nearby. 2 chairs, their upholstery long since rotted away, were overturned nearby. In one corner, a cast-iron stove stood sentinel, its surface marred by rust but still solid. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I noticed papers littered across the floor. They crunched under my feet as I moved further into the cabin, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I'd bent down to pick up a yellowed piece of paper, which seemed to be a letter. The paper was fragile, threatening to crumble in my hands, and the ink had faded significantly over time. It was hard to make out the faded ink, but the words "help" and "trapped" were unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to decipher more of the letter's contents. Who had written this? And what kind of dire circumstances had led them to pen such a desperate plea? As I squinted at the faded text, trying to make out more words, I became aware of a change in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. The silence, which had been absolute just moments before, now felt charged with an expectant energy. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught my attention. It was a low rustling, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly stuffed the letter into my pocket. My heart began to race, pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard echoing through the empty cabin. I stood frozen for a moment, straining my ears to catch any further sound. The rustling had stopped, leaving behind a silence that seemed even more oppressive than before. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way to one of the broken windows, peering out into the clearing. Stepping outside, I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was eerily quiet again, the birds and insects that had been so vocal earlier now conspicuously silent. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to loom larger, their shadows stretching towards me like grasping fingers. I decided it was time to head back to the RV. The uneasy feeling had returned, stronger than before. As much as I wanted to explore further, to unravel the mystery of the letter and the abandoned cabin, my instincts were screaming at me to leave. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to take on a sinister quality. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I sped up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my campsite. The forest, which had seemed so inviting and peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows seemed to move at the corner of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. By the time I broke through the tree line and into the clearing where my RV was parked, I was almost running. Relief washed over me as I saw the familiar shape of my temporary home. But that relief was short-lived. As I approached the RV, I noticed something was off. The door, which I distinctly remembered closing and locking before I left, was slightly ajar. My heart, which had just begun to slow down, started racing again. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. I stood at the base of the steps, paralyzed with indecision. Should I go inside and confront whatever, or whoever might be waiting? Or should I turn and run, leaving all my possessions behind? The rational part of my brain argued that it could have been an animal, drawn by the smell of food. But the primal part, the part that had been on high alert since I woke up, whispered that something far more dangerous was waiting inside. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and cautiously stepped inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I entered, my eyes darting around, taking in every detail. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the coffee pot was smashed on the floor, its contents forming a dark stain on the linoleum. The contents of my backpack were scattered around, as if someone had been searching for something specific. Fear gave way to anger. Someone had been here, had violated the sanctuary I had sought in this wilderness. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in the RV, its weight providing a small measure of comfort and security. Gripping the knife tightly, I stepped back outside, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The peaceful sanctuary I had sought had transformed into a threatening, alien landscape. That's when I saw him. A man was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his lean frame in dirty rags. But it was his eyes that captured my attention. They were fixed on me with a disturbing intensity, a mix of curiosity and something darker, more dangerous. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the knife tighter. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, a mixture of fear and bravado that didn't quite ring true. The stranger didn't respond, just stood there, staring. His silence was more unnerving than any response could have been. Then slowly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that for a moment I thought I might have imagined the whole thing. But the broken coffee pot and scattered belongings in my RV told me this was all too real. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Who the hell was this guy, and what did he want? I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my escape from reality. I had come here to find peace, to reconnect with myself, and I'll be damned if I was going to let this stranger chase me away. Making a split-second decision that I would later question, I decided to follow him. It wasn't the smartest move. I knew that even then, but something drove me forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a misplaced sense of bravado. Or maybe it was simply the need to understand what was happening in this seemingly peaceful forest. I set off in the direction I had seen him disappear, keeping my distance but staying close enough to keep him in sight. The man moved quickly through the forest, almost as if he knew it like the back of his hand. He navigated the uneven terrain with an ease that spoke of long familiarity, while I struggled to keep up, branches slapping against my face and thorns scratching my arms. As we moved deeper into the forest, the undergrowth became denser, the trees closer together. The canopy overhead blocked out more and more of the sunlight, casting the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, damper, filled with the musty scent of decay. I lost sight of the stranger several times, my heart racing each time until I caught a glimpse of his ragged form moving ahead of me. He seemed to be leading me somewhere specific, though to what end I couldn't begin to guess. After what felt like hours of this tense pursuit, we arrived at another clearing. This one was different from the peaceful glade where my RV was parked. The trees here were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like grasping claws. At the center of the clearing stood a large, ominous-looking structure. It was an old warehouse, a hulking monstrosity of corrugated metal and broken windows. The building seemed entirely out of place in the middle of the forest, a relic of industry incongruously placed in this wild setting. Nature had begun to reclaim it, with ivy climbing up its walls and small trees pushing up through cracks in the concrete foundation. The man slipped inside through a broken window, moving with the ease of long practice. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the knife clutched tightly in my sweaty hand. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to run to the safety of my RV and drive as far away from this place as I could. But I had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and followed the stranger into the warehouse. The interior of the warehouse was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. Shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom through holes in the roof and broken windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The vast space was filled with the hulking shadows of abandoned machinery, their purpose long since forgotten. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls, the noise bouncing around the cavernous space in a disorienting cacophony. I moved cautiously, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every sound a possible danger. As I navigated through the cluttered space, I saw him again. The stranger was standing at the far end of the room, his wild figure silhouetted against a shaft of light from a broken window. He stood perfectly still, watching me with those unsettling eyes. "Why are you following me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. His tone was curious rather than threatening, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Amusement, perhaps, or resignation. "I should be asking you the same thing," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My voice shook slightly, betraying my nervousness. "What do you want from me?" He let out a low, humorless laugh. The sound sent chills down my spine, a mirthless noise that seemed to hold years of pain and bitterness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, shaking his head slowly. "This place isn't for people like you." I felt a surge of defiance at his words. Who was he to tell me where I should or shouldn't be? "And what exactly is this place?" I demanded, gesturing around at the decaying warehouse. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the warehouse, disappearing behind a stack of rusted machinery. I hesitated for a moment before following him. Every step I took felt like a mistake, but I couldn't turn back now. I needed answers. We navigated through a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. The layout of the warehouse seemed to defy logic, with hallways that curved when they should have been straight, and rooms that seemed larger on the inside than they could possibly be. Finally, we arrived at a large open space that seemed to be some sort of makeshift living quarters. There were beds cobbled together from old pallets and tattered blankets, mismatched furniture arranged in a semblance of a living room, and even a small wood-burning stove in one corner. The walls were covered in strange symbols and writing, a chaotic mix of what looked like mathematical equations, snippets of poetry, and wild, abstract drawings. "Welcome to my home," the stranger said, his voice tinged with a hint of sarcasm. He gestured around the room with a sweeping motion, as if presenting a grand palace rather than a squalid squat in an abandoned warehouse. I looked around, trying to take in the bizarre scene before me. "You live here?" I asked, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. He nodded, a wry smile twisting his lips. "I've been living here for years," he said, "ever since I disappeared." "Disappeared?" I asked, confusion evident in my voice. "Yeah, disappeared," he repeated, his tone matter-of-fact. "Like all those people you read about in the papers, just vanished without a trace." He paused, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "Only I didn't vanish. I chose to live off the grid, away from society." As he spoke, I started to piece it together. This guy was one of those missing persons you hear about on the news, the ones who vanish and are never found. But he hadn't been taken, hadn't met with some terrible fate. He had chosen this life, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. "Why?" I asked, my curiosity overriding my fear. "Why live like this?" He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, as if I were a child asking why the sky was blue. "Because society is broken," he said, his voice low and intense. "People are selfish, cruel, and deceitful. Out here, I'm free. I don't have to answer to anyone." I looked around at the squalid conditions, the makeshift bed, the walls covered in frantic scribbles. This didn't look like freedom to me. "But you're not free," I argued. "You're trapped here, just like that letter said." His eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment I feared I'd pushed too far. "You read the letter?" he demanded, taking a step towards me. I stood my ground, though my heart was racing. "Yeah, I did. Someone was asking for help. Who was it?" He laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "That was me, a long time ago," he said. "I thought I wanted to be found, but then I realized I was better off alone." I felt a chill run through me. This guy was clearly unhinged. I needed to get out of there, and fast. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't want any trouble. I'll just go, and we can both pretend this never happened." He shook his head slowly, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I can't let you do that," he said softly. "You know too much." Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the knife out of my hand. We struggled, rolling across the dirty floor. He was stronger than he looked, and I was quickly overpowered. He pinned me down, his hands closing around my throat. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur. In a desperate move, I reached for a nearby piece of broken glass and slashed at his arm. He screamed in pain and released his grip. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife and running for the exit. I could hear him behind me, cursing and stumbling. The warehouse seemed even more maze-like as I frantically searched for a way out. I burst through a door and found myself back in the main area of the warehouse. Spotting the broken window I'd entered through, I made a beeline for it. I burst out of the warehouse and into the forest, running as fast as I could. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear his footsteps behind me getting closer and closer. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, leaving stinging cuts. I tripped over exposed roots, each time certain that this would be when he caught me. But somehow, I managed to keep going, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I broke through the trees and into the clearing where my RV was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp my phone, but I managed to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was like a lifeline. There's a man, I gasped, trying to catch my breath. He's trying to kill me. Stay calm, sir, the operator said. Where are you? I gave them my location, praying they would get here in time. As I spoke, I could hear the man outside, banging on the door and shouting incoherently. I grabbed the hunting rifle I kept in the RV, loading it with trembling hands. The banging stopped, and everything went silent. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers quickly surrounded the RV, weapons drawn. I opened the door, hands raised, and they rushed in, securing the area. They found the man a short distance away, bleeding from the cut on his arm and mumbling to himself. He was taken into custody and later identified as Leonard Bain, a man who had been missing for over a decade. In the days that followed, the truth about Leonard Bain came to light. He had been a brilliant mathematician who had suffered a mental breakdown after the death of his wife and child in a car accident. Unable to cope with his loss and feeling betrayed by a world that would allow such tragedy, he had retreated into the wilderness. The police found evidence of his crimes in the warehouse. To my horror, they discovered the remains of several missing persons who had met a gruesome end at his hands. It seemed that over the years his isolation had warped his mind, turning him into a predator who saw any intrusion into his domain as a threat to be eliminated. The story made headlines across the country. I was hailed as a hero for helping to bring him to justice, but I felt no pride in my role. Only a deep, pervasive sense of sadness for the lives lost and the brilliant mind that had been twisted by grief and isolation. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest, which had once been a place of solace, now felt like a place of nightmares. I knew I'd never come back here, but I couldn't forget what had happened. Leonard Bain had chosen his isolation, but it had driven him to madness, and I had stumbled into his dark world by chance. It was a stark reminder of how thin the line between sanity and madness could be, how easily a person could lose themselves if they strayed too far from the bonds of society. The authorities cleaned up the site, and the remains were identified and returned to their families for proper burial. Life went on, but I was forever changed by that encounter. The scars on my neck were a constant reminder of how close I had come to death. I returned to Chicago, but I couldn't go back to my old life. The experience had shaken me to my core, making me question everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. I left my job in software engineering and went back to school, studying psychology with a focus on trauma and isolation. Years later, I found myself working with people who, like Leonard Bain, had retreated from society. Some were suffering from mental illness, others were simply overwhelmed by the complexities of modern life. I helped them find their way back, to reconnect with the world and with themselves. Every now and then, I would think back to that day in the forest, to the abandoned cabin with its desperate plea for help, to the warehouse that had become a madman's lair, I thought about how easily I could have become another victim, another set of bones hidden away in that desolate place. But more than that, I thought about Leonard Bain. About the man he had been before grief and isolation had twisted him into something monstrous. And I realized that in helping others, in reaching out to those who had retreated from the world, I was in a way helping him too. The man he had been, the man he could have been if things had been different. In the end, I realized that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't hiding in the dark. They're right there in plain sight, wearing the face of a man who just wanted to be left alone. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to fight back, not just against the physical threat, but against the isolation and despair that can turn a person into something they never meant to be. As I sit here now, years later, writing this account, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. Fear, certainly, at the memory of my brush with death, sadness for the lives lost, but also hope. Hope that by sharing this story, by reaching out to those who feel lost and alone, we can prevent more Leonard Bains from emerging from the shadows. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our place in this world. And sometimes, all it takes is a hand reaching out in the darkness to guide us back to the light.